Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hi, this is Dave.
And this is John.
And welcome to episode 57 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is documentary filmmaker Morgan Spurlock, who shot to fame with the release of his 2004 film Super Size Me, in which he ate nothing but McDonald's for a month. He went on to produce other feature documentaries such as Where in the World is Osama bin Laden and Palm Wonderful Presents The Greatest Movie Ever Sold, as well as TV shows such as 30 Days. His most recent film, Comic-Con 4: A Fan's Hope, takes an inside look at one of the world's largest pop culture events, the 2010 San Diego Comic-Con.
All right, well, let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Morgan Spurlock. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
All right, so first of all, just how did the idea for this movie come about?
Yeah, the whole concept behind Comic-Con Episode 4: A Fan's Hope came from the first visit that I ever paid to Comic-Con. Like, I'd wanted to go for years. Like, I'd always wanted to go. I'd seen it in the news, heard people talk about it, and had never, for one reason or the other, been able to actually attend. And then in 2009, I was approached by Fox to do the Simpsons 20th anniversary special for them. And so the minute I got that phone call from Fox, I was like, we're going to Comic-Con. I was like, we're going to Comic-Con. We're going to go there. We're going to find Simpsons super fans. We're going to have like an American Idol casting, and we're going to find these people who love The Simpsons more than anything. And while we were there shooting, I was like, this is like a movie. Like, this is a place where we could make a great film just about the characters, the people. And then later on that night, I met Stan Lee for the first time. And I went over to introduce myself, to kiss the ring. You know, I was like, Mr. Lee, as a kid growing up in West Virginia, reading your comic books, I just want you to know you changed my life. Your stories kind of encouraged me and gave me the drive to want to go out and tell my own stories. And he's like, oh, Morgan, thanks. I really appreciate that. Wow. I don't even know what to say. It's like, you know what? You know what we should do? We should make a movie together. We should make a documentary. We should make a documentary about Comic-Con. And I was like, that's a great idea, Mr. Lee. Thank you so much. And I literally turned around. And right after I met him, I turned around. This is a party for CAA. Like, his agency was CAA, and so is mine. This was this crazy, weird Hollywood moment. I turned around, and Peter Michelli, who's an agent at CAA, was standing right behind me, and he goes, how was it meeting Stan? And I was like, it was amazing. We want to make a movie about Comic-Con. And he's like, that's a great idea. You should meet my client who's coming into town tomorrow. Cut to tomorrow, as I was having breakfast with Joss Whedon at his hotel, told him the whole idea. We want to make a film, follow people into Comic-Con, and Joss was like, I love it. I'm in. So, like, literally in 48 hours, we had Joss and Stan on board to make this movie, which, a year later we were shooting. It was crazy.
So would you consider yourself a comic book geek? Currently, obviously when you were a kid, you were.
I buy and read probably more comics now than I did as a kid. I guess people, that's what they say. They're like, the comic book business is dying. And I was like, no, the book business is dying. I don't know many people who go out and buy physical, paper comic books anymore. But since I got my iPad and got turned on to Comixology, I buy more stuff from Comixology than I ever did as a kid. But it's just because it's so much more accessible. I have so much more access to it. So for me, I think that I think it's so alive and well, and it's reaching just this very different generation. I just think that people buying physical paper comics isn't happening.
So what are some of your favorites that you're reading right now?
Irredeemable. I loved Irredeemable and Incorruptible, which was the amazing Mark Waid series. That's probably, I'm catching up on that because I got behind while we were in production and shooting on that whole series. So I've got the last batch of that to get through. DMZ, I got lost in that series while we were shooting the film, so I'm catching up on the DMZs. And but those are probably the biggest two. And then I tell you what, I just started rereading. Once I heard that they were making it into once I heard they were starting to make production into the film on it, was Why the Last Man, which I started rereading again, which I loved that the first time, and now it's just the idea of them just making that into one movie, I'm so kind of distraught over, but we'll see what happens.
So unlike your previous movies, you don't appear in this one at all. Why did you decide to take that route?
Comic books succeed and have succeeded for decades because of fans, because people who love them. Big giant, Hollywood genre movies succeed because of fans. Video games have become popular and more popular over the years because of fans. So for me, this is a film that was very much rooted in those people, in their passions, in their desire, their obsessions. And so I really wanted to tell the story through these people that kind of make Comic-Con what it is. And as much as I am a fan, I don't go to Comic-Con every year. The first time I went was for work, and so for me, making a movie about Comic-Con just didn't make sense. I mean, it needed to be about these people. And when we first started going out and pitching the film to investors, we were going to investors saying, here's what the film is, here's who we're going to tell the stories about. And they're like, yeah, we love it. This is great. We'll give you the money, but we want you to be in the film. And I was like, well, then we'll find the money somewhere else. We'll find a different investor because that's just not what the movie is. And it was the best choice because ultimately, again, it is a movie about those people. And I tell people, I mean, people all the time are like, yeah, I haven't really liked any of your other films. And I'm like, well, then you're going to love this one. You're going to love this movie because I'm not in one frame of the whole thing.
Yeah, so how did you go about selecting the people who actually do appear in the movie?
We're trying to figure out who are the archetype characters that we want to follow. Who are we going to kind of chase after? And it was Stan, I think, who was the first person to suggest, focusing on the portfolio review, telling that story, which was a great idea. Joss brought up The Masquerade, saying, have you ever seen that? Said the costumes these people make are amazing. Harry Knowles was the one who suggested Chuck Rosansky because Harry Knowles' father, had a comic book shop, was one of the people who was instrumental in creating the Texas Comic-Con. And so he's known Chuck for years. So he says, oh my gosh, if you want somebody who knows everything there is to know about the comic book business, you got to get Chuck. And then what we did is we kind of created this kind of casting call that we sent out to comic book shops, that we sent out to fan sites, that Harry blasted out through Ain't It Cool News. And we ended up getting about 2,000 submissions from people from all around the world. And these were just like emails, videos, a lot of whom were like, yeah, get me a ticket, I'll come, which was not what the movie is. We didn't get any of these people tickets. The only people we wanted to follow were people who were already coming. Like, if you're already coming, we want to hear your story. What is your story? Tell us, why, you think you should be a part of the film. And then we just started whittling it down. And Holly Conrad was the very first person that we cast in the film. We got her video, and I was blown away. I think she represented for me kind of the litmus test, the bar that we should kind of be measuring all the rest of our submissions to. And she's amazing.
Is she's the designer?
She's the costume designer.
Yeah,
she's the girl who's preparing for the Masquerade, making the costumes from Mass Effect out of her garage, her and her friends. It's her third Masquerade. You're only allowed to compete in the Masquerade at Comic-Con 3 times. And then after that, you're considered a professional costume designer. So this is kind of her swan song as competing as an amateur. So she really wanted to win. Like, she was really going at it to make sure that she could, give it her all and use this as her final calling card to try and break into the costume business in Hollywood.
No, her costumes were absolutely amazing. All the animatronics that she's doing in her garage. Did you get any sense of how she was able to do that?
Well, she'd worked at costume shops and worked with other designers before, and then her friends, the people that are building the stuff with her, had also been people who'd worked at like Henson and a couple of the other like animatronic places that design stuff for theme parks. So they are this incredible group of creative friends that had been doing this for a while, that they just all come together to kind of realize her vision and this game and these characters. And I mean, it's remarkable. Like, they are super talented.
Well, and how about the soldier too? Was definitely not your stereotypical idea of a comic book artist. How did he get involved?
The soldier, yeah. I mean, again, it was one of those people who, Eric sent he'd heard about the submission. He sent us his video, said he wanted to go to Comic-Con. And what was interesting about Eric was he didn't even want to go to Comic-Con, and he has a friend on the Army base with him who's a professional power lifter. This is a guy who, goes and he trains and he competes in powerlifting competitions. And years ago, this powerlifter friend of his who was, getting bigger, getting stronger, but would never enter a competition, a friend of his said, you know what, he goes, you just need to do it. You just need to take this chance. So his friend bought him an entry and a plane ticket to a powerlifting competition and sent him, made him go. And so the powerlifter friend said to Eric, he goes, you've been drawing for years. I've seen your stuff. You're amazing. You finally have to do this. And so his friend bought him a ticket and a pass to Comic-Con, bought him a plane ticket and a pass to go. And that's the only reason Eric was going. Like, Eric never would have forced himself to do it had the friend not done it. And so he sent us this video, told this story. We saw his work, and I was just like, the story of Eric with his wife and his kids, and he's in the Air Force there's just something amazing about him. And the guy's an incredible talent. And now since the film has gone on to do multiple covers for like Arch Enemy Comics and a few other places. I mean, the guy is really talented.
When the movie eventually comes out on DVD, are there going to be are those videos that the people submitted actually going to be on there as available as extras, or?
Yeah, they won't be in the first pass of the DVD because we couldn't find. We could only find one or two. Like Holly's is actually online. Like if you do a search on YouTube for Holly Conrad, like Comic-Con submission video, you'll see her video on the internet. Which by the time she submitted it to us, like she submitted it to me, there were no hits on it. Literally within like the first day, it had gone over thousands of hits. Like it was amazing how many people had watched it.
What were the logistics like for making this movie? Just how many people were involved, cameras, stuff like that?
Yeah, my God, it was massive. It was the biggest movie I've ever made, and there's so much to manage because how do you capture Comic-Con? How do you capture that huge event? And so we were following basically like 10 characters into Comic-Con. And so we had 15 film crews, one camera for each one of those crews, and an additional 5 crews that were shooting, panels or signings or just B-roll at any given moment. Within each of those crews, there was a second camera that could either be taken to a different location or used within that shoot. So during the shoot, there was usually anywhere between 15 and 28 cameras that were shooting over the course of the 5 days of Comic-Con. There was a crew of 150 people that we had working on the film. Everything from, of course, the sound and camera crews to production assistants to location assistants to like talent scouts, people who were like going around the floor trying to basically find people, publicists that were helping to arrange the interviews that were shooting on the Sykes, gaffers, grips, electrics. I mean, it was huge. Data wranglers. I mean, that's things we were shooting about 100 hours of footage a day. So we're having to wrangle all that footage at the same time that we can also watch every night. So every night when we're done shooting, I would go down with the data wranglers. We would watch, footage from select, cameras, basically the ones that were following our characters. We weren't even watching B-roll. We were literally just watching everything that was surrounding all the characters, making sure that whatever key story points there were, the key things that happened that day, we followed up on the next day. We knew what was happening when. I mean, it was a massive, massive undertaking.
And so you ended up with like something like 300 hours then of footage?
We ended up with like 600 hours,
okay.
Like about 650 hours over the course of the week.
So what was it like trying to cut that down to an hour and a half?
It was, there was a lot. I mean, we started off with, you start separating things into kind of pods when you do that. So first off, you edit each character's story as kind of its own little short film, beginning, middle, and end of each character. Starting off at their home, here they are at the con, then they go home, beginning, middle, end of everybody's kind of journey along the way. Then we go through all the celebrity interviews, like the directors, the actors, the comic book creators, the people who work for the dark horses of the world. We start going through there and mining for the best sound bites that kind of deal with different types of story points along the way, whether it's about Comic-Con itself, it's about fans, it's about the future. You start breaking them into categories. Same thing with the fans. We do the same thing about, with all of their psych footage. And then you put all the B-roll in a bin, where all the B-roll shots, daytime, nighttime, transitional, character shots, panel shots, all that stuff that we'll start to fill in. And then you start to weave it together with your editors. And we had an amazing editorial team. Just like you make a longer cut that's like 3 hours, you whittle that down to about 2.5, then you whittle that down to 2, and then we just start knocking it down to 150, 145, until we got around where we are, which we're living at about an hour and a half movie.
Do you want to maybe mention just some of those celebrity interviews that you did?
Stan Lee and Joss Whedon were in the film, because these guys are very much quintessential, or I think the quintessential idea of who is at Comic-Con. They are like the old and new guard of that place. Then you have folks like Guillermo del Toro, Kevin Smith, Seth Rogen, Olivia Wilde, Seth Green, Matt Fraction, Joe Quesada. Oh my gosh, the list goes on and on. It's it was huge. I think we interviewed 80 people, 85 people over the course of that. And that's just, people who work from, in the comic book world. Kenneth Branagh, we interviewed as he was there, launching Thor at the time.
So did you have a sort of a standard set of questions you asked them all, or like how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, we asked them all about what do they, why do they come here? What do they think of it? What was their first experience like? What's the craziest thing they ever saw? Eli Roth talks about how the first time he ever took a pee next to a stormtrooper in a Klingon. That's something you'd only ever see at Comic-Con. There's something. There's something amazing, about a lot of these stories that came out. And that's the thing, is all these interviews, you're talking about the DVD, is each interview with each one of these people when you watch the film, is like 20 minutes long. Kevin Smith's interview is like, I think even longer. We might have even talked to him for like a half an hour, which you then cut down to ultimately being about a minute of the movie, sometimes less. And, there's all of this great footage that also will be expanded into the DVD because it's amazing.
So, I mean, I don't know if you've seen the documentary Trekkies, but has gotten a lot of criticism for sort of coming across as mean-spirited towards Star Trek fans. Was that something that sort of concerned you making this movie, how to kind of walk that line?
Well, I mean, for me, it's like, I wanted to make sure what Trekkies didn't do, which I think this film does a really good job of, is humanizing everybody that's in the movie. It's like we could have kind of done these asides with people and like, oh, here's Skip Harvey and look, there's his pillow shaped like Superman. But, what we wanted to make sure was that you understood the why behind their passion. Why does it matter to them? What drives them? Why do they care? And by doing that, you really start to get invested in them and their stories, and I think that you care what happens to Skip. You want Skip to succeed. You want Eric to succeed because you've seen him with his family and talking about why he loves comics so much. You want James Darling and Sei Young, like the couple who he's going to propose to his girlfriend during the Kevin Smith panel. Like you're riding along with him. You're nervous with him. You're nervous with Holly as she's competing in the masquerade, to see if she's going to win. Because, by giving you entree to these people where you kind of see them as real people, suddenly you are passionate about their stories and you are going on this vicarious journey with them and you are there with the ebb and flow of emotion. And I think that makes a big, big difference. And Trekkies didn't really do that. All of the people within our movie, there's the other thing that starts to set up our film differently is it's not just people as like, oh, look, and I'm a weirdo and look at where I sleep. And I feel like that what we do with this film is everybody in this movie has a purpose. That Anthony Calderon, who has a room filled with toys, he's a toy collector. He makes his own toys. Like if we'd have just left it at him with his toy collection, that's one thing. But he's on a mission when he goes to Comic-Con to get an 18-inch Galactus. He's so passionate about it. Like the guy can't, he is not leaving without that action figure. And even somebody like an Anthony, who he's got a wife and his kid. His wife doesn't really understand his collecting, but it's his thing. You see the passion behind him as he goes on this mission to get that one last toy, and you care. You actually care that he's there and chasing after it because you see how incredibly, one, you see that he's somebody who he's grounded in reality with his family, but at the same time, he's somebody who just has real passion. And I think that with all the characters in the film, they have a goal. Chuck, as here he is trying to make a certain amount of money to keep, his company open, Mile High Comics. He wants to make sure it's going to run. He wants to make sure people can have comics forever. He wants to make sure they're going to be able to experience them like he experienced them. Like that's something you're rooting for. You're rooting for that guy. And I think the more that you can really give people a purpose, again, that makes them real. And they're not just like spectacle.
I actually noticed with both the toy collector and the comic book dealer that they both seem to have spouses who weren't 100% on board with their. I mean, is that something you saw a lot?
There's plenty of women at Comic-Con. There's plenty of women that are supportive of their boyfriends. And look, there were couples that were on there. I love the couple that we're on our honeymoon at Comic-Con. This is what we both love. I mean, there's plenty of people that love it and embrace it. And I mean, you got to think that she embraces it. She may not understand why he likes to collect toys, but the guy still has a room in their house called the Room of Doom that's covered in toys that he makes his own action figures in. So she's incredibly understanding because she's basically let him take over a whole room of the house to put his toys in. And I think that, Chuck's wife, while she may not agree with some of his business choices, again, she's supportive. She's behind him. She goes, you know what? I may not get it, but I love you. And if this is a part of you, then I love it all.
Have you ever encountered a couple where the wife is really into comics and the husband just kind of humors her, or?
I'm trying. The thing is now that's starting. You're starting to see more of that, but it's not just. But I don't just think it's comics. I think that it's like there's a huge female gamer culture right now. Like there's a massive female gaming culture, and so Holly I think is very representative of that. Holly and her friends. Holly said something to me while we were filming with her, which I thought was pretty great. She said, "You got to understand." Like Mass Effect is to me and is to my generation what Star Wars was to you. Like these games are our trilogies. Like these are the movies that are these are the games that are kind of shaping us just like those movies shaped you as a kid. And I think that what you're seeing now is this generation of gamer girls like her who are incredibly good and gifted at all of these games and are really inspired by them. And even more so than I think some of the guys that that they're with. But I think that was something that we saw. We did see a lot of kind of gamer girls who were, while their boyfriends may be into something else, they may not be gamers.
So do you think the creators of Mass Effect will ever make a prequel series that will retroactively taint the entire product?
Yeah, and instead of putting animated characters in it, they're actually going to put live action characters in it. and we're going to go, I can't believe they put live action characters in there.
I mean, one thing that's presented in the film is sort of this idea that the actual comic book creators and dealers are starting to feel marginalized at Comic-Con.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think that it's the reality of the business. I mean, I feel like if you sell comic books, you're selling a business that is basically folding all around you. You know, people don't buy books. People aren't buying books. You know, people aren't buying these things as much as they used to. People are still buying and reading comics, but I just don't think they're buying physical paper comics. You know, I'd be curious to know how many kids are actually like, you know, collecting comics. You know, think about that. You know, it's like I had a closet full as a kid, you know, kept them way up into my adulthood, as did a lot of friends of mine. But how is any of that getting passed down? And I can't imagine that it is, unless like your father's like a super dedicated or mom is a super dedicated collector. It's just something that's kind of, I feel like it's kind of past. Books in general, you know, they're kind of going the way of the dodo. So, I mean, I think they're feeling marginalized simply just because that whole side of a publishing business is vanishing.
Well, but although in the movie, I mean, Chuck the dealer is really concerned the whole movie, but it all sort of turns out okay in the end. I mean,
Chuck makes his money. I mean, he's at a place where there's still plenty of people that go there and buy books. I mean, I have yet to go to a Comic-Con and not leave with some sort of a book, because there's always something that you want to buy, that you pick up a book and you're like, wow, this is pretty amazing. You know, whether it may be somebody who made like some sort of a limited edition graphic novel or whatever, but I mean, I always buy something. And yeah, so at the end of the day, he made enough money to cover the whole trip to Comic-Con. They made a big profit, you know, so everything was good. And Chuck's one of those people who Chuck is like a cat. Like, he will always land on his feet. He will always find a way. You know, what's happened kind of since the film is he has sold some of his big high dollar comics, you know, to continue to pay off some corporate debt, to expand the company. He's bought like a couple million more comics. I mean, I just heard he bought like another gigantic collection of comics from somebody. It's amazing.
How did he end up with all those comics in the first? Like, how did he end up with a warehouse of comics in the first place?
Well, he was one of the very first people. Like, the story of Chuck is interesting. Like, he was the very first like comic book millionaire. Like, he bought this collection of comics that it's a really famous collection of comics. I can't remember the guy's name who had it, but it had literally all of these old action comics, like the original Superman, all these comics that he bought and then was able to like resell, that basically made, you know, millions of dollars. And so he was like the poster child for the comic book millionaire, the guy who basically bought these books, turned them around, and made a huge profit. And then out of that, he just started buying more comics and turned that into a real legitimate business. And he did that. Like, I think he became the first comic book millionaire, I think either at like 19 or 20. Like, he was really young. And then basically from there just like took off and said, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep, you know, kind of being this intermediary for what I love, which is comic books.
So you made a whole documentary, The Greatest Movie Ever Sold, about the influence of advertising in the mass media. How do you think that affects the comic book industry in particular?
You know, the thing about the comic book industry is it's unless you are, it's a very niche business still, comic books. And I think that if you're somebody who's not into like comic books, you're not going to get advertised to or want to buy a comic book. I think that that's just something you have to kind of be, it has to be kind of part of your upbringing, part of your grown up or your kid DNA that kind of even infects you as an adult. Yeah, I think that, you know, for me, it's if they had more advertising or more marketing, you know, would more people read, do big movies? Will, like the Avengers, make more people want to read an Avengers comic? You know, I don't know. I mean, that's something I would love to have an answer to. I'd love to know that.
Are you bothered sort of by the product placement and stuff in those superhero movies?
Well, it depends on what it is. Like, if there's in movies like Iron Man, like the last Iron Man, where it felt like every other scene there was product placement. You know, there's like the new James Bond film that they're making right now, which a third of that movie, $150 million budget, $50 million of that movie came from product placement. So I'm dying to see what that film looks like. Yeah, I mean, at times it can be very, very distracting. I mean, I understand the reasoning behind it, you know, especially after making Greatest Movies. You start to get an understanding of how, you know, all of these studios want to offset some of their risk and some of this gigantic investment they're making. You know, if you're making a $200 million movie and somebody says, listen, we'll give you $40 million if we can, you know, have a scene in the movie where you blow up a 7-Eleven and put all those cups in our stores, you know, then you start to see why they want to do it. You know, I don't have a problem usually when certain things exist in the stores when they literally turn them into commercials. You know, you live in the real world. People do wear jeans. They drink Coke. They drive Camaros. It's like literally when the scene feels like and turns into a commercial for said product to make me, that literally takes me out of the narrative in a second.
Like in Iron Man 2, what were some of the most egregious ones?
Oh, like what was the Well, there was the it was the first one or second one was the whole Burger King, the Whopper scene. It was the second one where he's like, well, the second one was where he's walking out of the where is it, at the fair, at the grounds, where he's walking out eating the Whopper there. And then the first one he's eating like the Burger King sitting at the podium as he comes back. The second one he's doing it again as he comes walking out, and he does that. That's what, like, right where Stan Lee's cameo is, right where he walks by him, and he's walking out eating a Whopper right there or something. I mean, it's just things like that just drive me crazy.
I mean, you mentioned that the movie, two of the characters you follow is this guy and his girlfriend, and the guy's planning to propose to his girlfriend at the convention. Yeah. I found those scenes just like so awkward, and I was like grimacing and squirming through like so much of just what happens. I was just wondering, like, did you have any trouble like not reacting, knowing how high the stakes were and not giving away what was going on and stuff like that?
I mean, it's one of those things when you're in it. It's just you're there. You're basically doing everything you can just to make sure the train stays like the train stays on the rails at that moment. Like, you don't want to give anything away. You never want to talk about it. We never would talk about anything anywhere near or around Say Young. But that was the hard part, is a lot of the movies, like, he couldn't even get away from her to go get the ring. Like, he was trying to go get the wedding ring, and she wouldn't even let him go. He's like, I got to go to the bathroom. She's like, I'll wait outside. It's just, the guy, he was freaking out. And then literally it was like hours before he was able to get the ring. I mean, it was amazing.
So was there any material that you filmed that didn't make it into the movie that you think is worth mentioning?
Oh, I mean, there's so much stuff we shot. I mean, there's so many interviews with people that didn't even make it in, like Felicia Day, who I love Felicia Day. Like the interview with her, as we tried to cut into different places, just didn't fit with the other interviews that we had. Nathan Fillion, who was in the final cut up until our right before the premiere at Toronto last year, which we took him right out of the opening. And what he said, he has an amazing line. His interview said there's so many good things, but the one line that we took out was where he goes, Comic-Con is like a giant orgasm. He goes, it's like you prepare the whole year. Like, the whole year is just the build-up, and then Comic-Con is the release. It was such a good line, and we had tons of those. We had tons of great moments and interviews with people, and Jerry Robinson, which was such a bittersweet interview with him. He created the Joker, just passed away last year. There was great stuff that we had, and I think that when we start figuring out the best way to put this out on DVD or an expanded Blu-ray DVD, it's just gonna be a wealth of riches.
So you think you might release like a 600-hour extended edition?
If anybody would buy it, absolutely.
Hey, if there's one fan base that would buy something like that, it's comic book fans, right?
Exactly.
Okay, so are there any other documentaries that you think fantasy and science fiction fans should check out?
I mean, I don't know. It's like I love Darkon. I don't know if you guys have ever seen that movie. It's fantastic. There's this great film about all these guys who do live action role playing, and it's this amazing documentary that I think is just genius. I love that film. We talked about Trekkies, which I still like Trekkies, because I think just I love the characters that are in that film. There's an offshoot of this. Like, there's docs that I talk about all the time. Like, there's gateway docs. Like, I love to clue people into gateway docs. Like, if they haven't seen certain movies, like, they're like, docs are boring. I don't like to watch those. Movies like Heavy Metal Parking Lot, Hands on a Hard Body, American Movie. Like, these are great docs that people should watch. Like, if you like great, funny documentaries, like, those are just great docs that people should check out because they're really smart. They're really fun. Like, they play more like comedies than they do docs. King of Kong, one of the greatest documentaries ever made. There's just so many films like that I think people should get into. And then people who like sci-fi, like A Brief History of Time, the Errol Morris doc, the one that has Stephen Hawking in it, is an amazing film. Like, that's like the uber end all of sci-fi, that doc.
So, one location featured in the movie is a Geek themed bar that the character the Geek works at.
In Columbia, Missouri.
So, I mean, like, what kind of geeky stuff do they have in there?
Well, they've got drinks like on Geek Night where they have, people can come there and play video games or like Magic the Gathering or whatever. They need the card games that they play. That they have like geek themed drinks, so they're named after characters that are in Star Trek or Battlestar Galactica or or like Star Wars. They have all kinds of like different like character drink names, like a Boba Fett or a Greedo, which it's awesome. And Skip still bartends on Geek Night. So if you find yourself in Columbia, Missouri on a Monday, you have to go to his bar for Geek Night.
Is that the only geek-themed bar you know of, or are there others anywhere?
It's the only one that I know of, and it's not every day, so it's not geek-themed every day. It's just I think it's just one night a week it's geek-themed.
We'll have to work on that.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a Giger bar, like wherever that HR Giger bar is. I think it's in Switzerland or Germany. Which I think that's probably that's probably like the most great twisted probably geek bar I could think of, where like all the furniture looks like everything that's straight out of the movie Alien, and so you go in there and the entire bar feels like you're in the movie of an Alien set. Like he designed this entire creepy bar, which is fantastic. So like that's, I think in terms of like if you want to feel like you're in the middle of like a Cronenberg film, as well as like a Giger painting, like that's probably about as geeky as it gets.
Yeah, I've always had this dream of actually having a geek type bar like called Geektopia. But the problem is that I don't want to operate and run it. I just want to go to it.
That's right. Yeah, I just want to drink in it. Can I do that? I just want to stop by.
So are there any updates that you want to give us about the characters featured in the film, like what they're up to currently?
Well, the amazing thing, like Holly Conrad, who's in the film, she was basically hired as a wardrobe consultant for the Mass Effect film, which they're apparently doing a rewrite on that script now. So hopefully she will be engaged in that full time. She continues to make costumes. She was hired after the scene you see in the film where she made these Mass Effect costumes. She was hired by BioWare, the company that makes Mass Effect, to make costumes for Mass Effect 1 and 2, as well as like create costumes for the launch of Mass Effect 3, which was pretty amazing. James Darling and Sei Young, they did get married, so they are happily married and working in, like, he's working in film and she's getting ready to go back to graduate school.
Did Kevin Smith was he involved in their wedding?
Kevin Smith did not officiate their wedding. They did ask, but he was unavailable apparently. Eric Hansen has gone on to do multiple covers for comic books, post the film, which is amazing. And Skip is still working on his own, graphic novel. Probably the biggest story that's happened since then is like Chuck has sold some of his big high dollar comics. Like I think that's probably the bigger story that isn't talked about in the movie.
So like Eric, I was really intrigued by Eric's work. Is there like a website or something like I could find out?
I don't think he has a website yet. I'm going to see him at the premiere because he's stationed in Germany right now. He's still in the Air Force. And so he's coming to the premiere in Los Angeles, which is April 4th. And when he comes, I just want to ask him, if has he started to put up a website? Where's he putting his work right now? I think that he was dealing exclusively with Arch Enemy for a while, but now he's working with other folks. I'm curious if he's had anybody kind of help him establish himself on a greater level.
Okay, and finally, just are there any other recent or upcoming projects that you'd like to mention?
Yeah, probably the next thing that's going to be coming out for me is I've got a film that I'm finishing right now. It's going to premiere at the Tribeca Film Festival on April 21st. It's a movie that we made with Will Arnett and Jason Bateman, and it looks at the magical world of male grooming. It's called Mansome.
Well, what does that mean? Like, what is the magical world of male grooming?
Well, it's like I am one of the many people who I personally have been involved in male grooming for like the last 8 years as I've shaved around in a ridiculous mustache on my face. So me, along with other people who deal with lots of like body shaving, who deal with like these guys who get plastic surgery. There's guys who deal with other types of perfection, I guess, if they will, in their own grooming day. People who take hours to get ready before they go outside. I've got 2 words for you for a product you'll see in the film, which is a spectacular product, and that product's name is Fresh Balls. And the name pretty much says it all.
So this is like the mane and tail of your new movie, like.
I would say it is even. I'd say it's more. It's like the tail and tail. Yeah.
All right, great. So Morgan Spurlock, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Well, awesome, guys. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Morgan Spurlock for joining us on the show. And for our discussion today, we're going to be talking about science fiction conventions, and we're joined by a special guest geek, Chris Savasco. From 2003 to 2009, he was the editor of Paradox magazine, which published both historical fiction and speculative fiction with a period setting. His short fiction has appeared in Black Static, Leading Edge, and The Field Guide to Surreal Botany. He's also written an alternate history novel about 1066, and a historical thriller dealing with Lady Godiva, both of which he's currently shopping around to agents. So, Chris, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
And so I think sort of to start out with, I just want to talk about, sort of introduce people to science fiction conventions who have never been to one before and just give them an idea of kind of what they're like and why they might want to go. Because I think a lot of people read science fiction and never really go to conventions or think about it. And certainly that's how it was for me. You know, when I was a teenager, I used to read Asimov's magazine, and in the back of every issue, there would be the convention listing, where it would just be this big list of, you know, names of conventions and cities and dates and stuff. And I would just kind of flip past that, and it would never really register. I would just, I don't know, I sort of imagined like if this was something I should be going to, someone would have mentioned it to me, or, you know, I would, you know, it doesn't really ever explain what exactly it is or why you might want to go to that. So, yeah, so I mean, what was that kind of how did you guys sort of first hear about conventions, and kind of how did you start going to them?
You know, I mean, I first like really encountered conventions just in a professional setting. You know, I got the job at the magazine of fantasy and science fiction, and you know, my boss Gordon decided that he was going to go to some convention or other. I think it was just Worldcon, because Worldcon is the first one I went to. But yeah, I mean, I'd never considered going to one. I wasn't even really aware that they were there. I mean, I had heard of Star Trek conventions, and I had heard of Dragon Con because I was a D&D player. But like the other conventions that we tend to go to now, you know, in our community, like, you know, Worldcon and World Fantasy and like stuff like, and regional cons like ReaderCon or WizCon and like, you know, I didn't even know those existed. And of course I knew about the Hugo Awards, but I didn't know that Worldcon was a big convention where they presented those. But, you know, obviously I've become a bit of a convention junkie. I go to several every year. And I mean, it's sort of somewhat necessary to sort of network in the community and interact with your fans and whatnot. And so, I mean, it's like it's a thing science fiction and fantasy professionals sort of do to promote their work and whatnot. And so it's sort of required to some extent. But I mean, I actually legitimately enjoy going to them.
My experience pretty much mirrors both of yours. I was reading heavily in the science fiction and fantasy field, you know, as a teenager in the 80s, but I had absolutely no awareness of the conventions other than, even with, you know, Star Trek conventions, my only awareness of that was, you know, seeing it spoofed on Saturday Night Live and whatnot. Like, I didn't really know what that was about. I was also totally unaware of the short fiction magazines like Asimov's and whatnot, I guess mostly because my local bookstores didn't carry them. It wasn't until around, I guess around 2000 or 2001 when I started going, I was living in New York City at the time, and I started going to the KGB readings and hearing people there talking about conventions. And a couple years after that, when I launched Paradox magazine, was the first time that I actually sort of got my act together to try and check out one of the conventions, mostly at the time, like John said, you know, also for professional reasons, just to kind of promote the magazine at the time. But, you know, very quickly, I sort of became a convention junkie too. I mean, since then, I, you know, not a year's gone by that I haven't gone to at least, I would say, 3 conventions.
So what was the first one you went to?
It was actually World Fantasy, which I guess is kind of a cool one to go to because it, to this day, remains one of my top favorite conventions to go to. It was in Washington, D.C. at the time. It's kind of interesting thinking back on it now because, you know, when I go to conventions now, such a big part of it is, you know, kind of getting to hang out with my posse, you know, you guys and the wider posse that, you know, we all kind of meet up at these things. And at the time, you know, I hadn't met you yet. I really didn't know too many people in the field at all. And I kind of just went to it cold, you know, just showed up, you know, walked in not knowing anything about it or what to expect or even having any sort of wingmen or anyone with me to kind of negotiate it. But, you know, people really made me feel welcome right away. And it was just a whole lot of fun. And I was certainly, as well as there to, you know, promote things professionally, I was also in definite fanboy mode. I remember at that first convention, just sitting in awe at a reading that Stephen R. Donaldson was giving, you know, one of my major influences growing up, you know, reading as a teenager.
Well, actually, speaking of Stephen R. Donaldson, the first convention I went to was actually the International Conference on the Fantastica in the Arts, shortened to ICFA, which is in Florida every year. And, I went to that because I won the Asimov Award, which has since been renamed the Dell Award, but it's an award for undergraduate science fiction. And so if you win, they fly you to this convention. And so that was the first thing I'd ever been to. And I think the first night I was, and it's at this hotel and it's in Florida, so it's really nice weather and everything. It's sort of around spring break time. And I was just, everyone's out of the pool and sitting around the pool and in the hot tub and stuff. And I was just sitting in the hot tub and all these writers were passing around this bottle of Jim Beam. And the guy sitting next to me was like, "Hey, what's your name?" And I'm like, "Oh, I'm David." And he's like, "Hi, I'm Steve. Nice to meet you." And then like the next day I realized like, whoa, that was Stephen R. Donaldson. Holy crap. And when you're like 19, you're a 19-year-old aspiring science fiction writer hanging out in the hot tub with Stephen R. Donaldson and all these other people. I mean, that's just like, that's pretty mind blowing, Well, yeah, I guess we should just sort of say like what basically it's like going to a convention, right? So you buy a membership ahead of time and then you show up at a hotel. Usually, if it's a big one like Worldcon, it's also at a convention center, but usually you're talking about one hotel. And you show up and you give them your name and they give you a name badge and a schedule and stuff. And in various rooms around the hotel, there will be panels going on. And there's usually a dealer's room where you can buy books. There's filking, which is, it's sort of folk music about fantasy and science fiction characters and themes and stuff.
Although even that'll vary from convention to convention. I mean, you'll get that at a Lunacon, but not necessarily at a World Fantasy.
I think World Fantasy might actually ban it. World Fantasy has a lot of rules. It tends to be more of a professional sort of con, although fans are welcome to attend. But I mean, they cap the membership to keep it a little smaller. But they, it's actually usually over Halloween weekend. Sometimes it misses Halloween itself, but it's always right around then. So it's frequently actually on Halloween occurs during the convention, but they ban you from wearing costumes. So it's just kind of funny, because I that's part of what them trying to be professional. Cause you go to something like Worldcon, sometimes people dress up like a Klingon or, whatever. And I went to a Balticon, which is in Baltimore one time, and there was a lot of people dressed up there. And that varies a lot from con to con as well.
But I mean, I think, in the popular imagination, you imagine going to a convention like everyone's dressed up as a Klingon, and that's not what it's like at all. I mean, most people are just dressed, in normal street clothes. I mean, there are, a lot of people like the women will sometimes wear corsets and sort of more Renaissance-y kinds of gowns and stuff like that. Although like at Worldcon, I mean, they have actually a masquerade ball where, you show off your costumes and they have sort of a dance and a sort of costume competition and stuff like that.
Yeah. I mean, Balticon is the only one that really comes to mind for me of the smaller conventions, the regional ones where I remember, a lot of people dressed up. But for the most part, it's pretty sedate as far as that goes. But yeah, I mean, in addition to the panels and stuff like Dave was saying, also most conventions have a lot of readings by authors. So it'll be the author reading either a short story they wrote or an excerpt of their novel and stuff like that. I think it's a fun way to sort of discover some new writers and stuff. Like if you go just pop into a reading, like somebody you met who you meet somebody randomly at the con and they seem to be cool. Like, so you just go and check out their reading and then, it's a fun way to sort of expand your horizons within the genre.
That's kind of how Dave and I met at Lunacon. We each went to each other's reading at that first Lunacon that we met. We were each the only one to show up to each other's reading.
Well, it's funny too how, there are particular authors who are bestsellers in the wider world but aren't that popular if you go to their reading at a convention, and there are some authors who don't sell that well in the wider world but are super, super popular at particular conventions and stuff. I mean, there's actually one year I was at World Fantasy Con, and there they had this in the dealer's room, they had every author do a signing all at the same time. And so I went to that room and there was just this huge line. And so I just, I figured that was the line to get into the event. And so I just get in the line. And this woman comes up to me after a couple of minutes and she's like, "Are you here? Are you having stuff signed by Charles DeWin?" And I was like, "That's kind of a random question." I'm like, "No." And she's like, "Oh, you can just go in, and then this is just the line for Charles DeWin." And like every author, basically, you could just walk up to them and have something signed, but there's this huge line for Charles DeWin.
Actually, I have a story about World Fantasy and the mass signing. But so I had a dream one time where I met Neil Gaiman at a convention and he was doing a reading or something, and I went up to say hello to him, because I've like worked with him, but but I've never met him. So he doesn't say anything to me. He just hands me 5 gold doubloons. I don't know. That's all I remember about the dream. So I woke up and I told my wife about it, and she's also a big Neil Gaiman fan, so it was like I thought it was funny, and so I sort of forgot about it, and then so come World Fantasy last year. Neil Gaiman was guest of honor. So, my wife actually set up this elaborate conspiracy for me to meet Neil Gaiman. And so at one point we're at the signing and she just drags me over. She like drags me away from my table. She's like, "Come with me." And I see we're walking towards Neil's table and I'm like, am I about to meet Neil Gaiman? And she's like, "Just come on." And so she brings me over there, and we're there with one of Neil's Clarion students, Kat Howard, who's also an author I published. But she and Neil are friends, and so I see that. Oh, okay. Well, obviously Kat set up this meeting, but so Christy and I go over there, and we're standing next to his table, and he's got he's got one of those lines that are wrapped around the the hotel. He's signing the book, and then he sort of pauses and he points at me, and he just does a little "come here" gesture. So I sort of lean in and he just reaches into like a pocket and hands me 5 gold doubloons. It doesn't say anything. He just goes back to signing. And so I just look at my wife and I'm like, "What just happened?" And so that's obviously became clear that she and Kat Howard had set up this elaborate thing to to get Neil to do this, and so that was pretty awesome.
That's cool that you had that kind of experience. I've often found that it's really sort of awkward meeting my favorite writers because, especially when you're new, you get into a conversation with them and I just don't know what to say. I mean, it's like you can ask them questions, but most of them I've, been stalking them my whole life. I basically know everything there is to know about them anyway. It was, actually one, I think it was a Worldcon I went to, there was a panel, it was sort of like how to survive your first con or something. And Robert Silverberg was on it. And of course he's been to every convention, so he had a lot of good advice. But one of his pieces of advice was that you sort of imagine that you're going to go as a new writer and just be hanging out with all your favorite writers and become the best friends with them and stuff. And he's like, "Well, you have to understand that it was all these big name writers have been going to these things for decades and they're friends with everybody already. And when they come to a convention, they want to meet their agent and meet their editor and, hang out with their friends and stuff. And that you're probably more likely to make friends with other new writers."
In a way, though, it is, a story that I have is I, like most people, I think, who were growing up in the 80s, as a teenager, I was a big fan of Piers Anthony's work. And Piers Anthony is sort of notorious for never going to conventions. And I remember, just reading some random thing somewhere back in around 2006 that he was going to be appearing at a smallish convention in Florida called Oasis Con. And it was the first time in a decade he'd been to a convention and, probably won't go to one for another 10 or 15 years. And so I just, on a whim, thought, I never would have gone down to Oasis Con because I was in Florida. I was living in New York at the time, but I wanted to go just on the chance of, getting to meet Piers Anthony. And so I went and, first night there, I find myself in the convention suite sitting around a coffee table eating soggy potato chips with Piers Anthony and his daughter and one other person. And we were just hanging out there for an hour.
But I'm trying to think what other advice people give you. I mean, one thing with conventions is that, there's all these people who share your interests and stuff. And there's just this tendency to not get any sleep and not eat and stuff. And so there's this rule that you're supposed to get at minimum, you're supposed to bathe once a day, eat at least 2 meals and get at least 3 hours of sleep or something.
I think that's in life, not just at conventions.
Well, in regular life, I hope you get more sleep than that, at least.
Right. I don't know if I had a piece of advice for someone, sort of new to the convention scene. This is not a mistake, but something that I did that I'm sure a lot of people would do is, you show up to your first one or two conventions, kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, thinking like, you've written down, a very detailed schedule of the 32 different panels you're planning to attend, and the 16 readings and all these different things that look really cool on the schedule, and they all generally are. But at the same time, you very quickly realize, number one, it's not realistic to actually think that you're going to be running around like that the whole day going to every single thing, and also, more importantly, you very quickly come to realize that some of the best parts of conventions are the parts that happen in between the scheduled programming or after the scheduled programming is over, when it's more sort of just an informal setting where you're just hanging out with old friends and new friends, and kind of chatting about the genre and chatting about the field. And that's when you could, whether you're there as just sort of a fan who enjoys talking about this stuff, or you're there professionally and you're kind of schmoozing and making connections that way. I mean, that's in some ways really what the heart of most conventions are, I think. And that's something that it sometimes takes a couple of conventions before you come to realize that.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely found that the more veteran somebody is at conventions, the less they tend to actually go to any of the programming. There's a funny thing. Sometimes people will say, I'm attending BarCon, which is where they didn't actually buy a membership. They just show up at the hotel where the convention's going on and just hang out in the bar, hanging out with people. And that's kind of frowned on, because then you're not supporting the convention. But, sometimes if people are, short on cash or something, they might do that.
Yeah, and actually, speaking of supporting the convention, it actually, like, if you do go to one, it actually is really important to support the convention, because these things are all run by fans. And so even something like big like Worldcon, I mean, relatively big, I mean, at least, 5,000 people, that's all staffed by volunteers. And so, yeah, I mean, it's important to support the convention, with your membership, and also, to keep in mind when things go wrong that, these people are, they're fans who have full-time jobs, and they're, they're devoting a bunch of their time to throw this convention.
Do you guys have any tips for, like, if you're a panelist, how you should comport yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think just be prepared and, be respectful. And although I would say, you do have to be prepared to jump in when there's a moment's opportunity, because it's like you can very easily get shut out of talking at a panel at all, because there's a lot of people, they don't want to give up the floor.
Well, yeah, I mean, theoretically, on all these panels, there's supposed to be a moderator who's supposed to sort of make sure everyone gets a chance to talk, but they often don't do a particularly good job. And like, what can be just deadly is if the moderator themselves is a windbag. It just goes on, and then there's really no, you can't stop them. They've got the moderator hat, and it's just like this out of control monster.
Luckily, that's the minority of panels, though. So.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, my advice is the same as John's, with just the additional advice that if you do find yourself in the role of moderator, one thing that I've come to realize is, if you're preparing sort of a list of questions that you want to sort of guide the topic, on the one hand, you should be prepared to be flexible, so that if the conversation starts to kind of veer in a different direction that's also interesting and on point, to kind of be willing to let it go that way, as long as it's not going off on an unrelated tangent. And at the opposite extreme, I would say, make sure that you bring about 10 times as many questions as you think you're actually going to have time for, because there's nothing worse than being a moderator and kind of getting through your list and looking at your watch and realizing you're only halfway through the time you have allotted.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember as an attendee is that, if you get into one of these panels that has like a windbag on it or something, and you're like, this is not interesting, you can just get up and leave. I mean, people do it all the time. I mean, if you do that, though, I would say, try to let the door close, because not everybody does that, and it's like, it can be a little annoying when that keeps happening. But no, I mean, you can definitely unobtrusively slip out of the room. So
I mean, my big piece of advice, this was actually something else Robert Silverberg said, but like, don't use the panel as an excuse to hard sell your book. Mm-hmm. That's like, it's so annoying. And I mean, the thing is, like, if you just try to hard sell your book nonstop, you're not gonna, like, A, you're gonna annoy everyone, and B, no one's gonna want to buy your book anyway. Whereas if you just seem interesting, and you talk about the topic, that's going to interest people in your work a lot more than, just pitching it over and over again.
Yeah, so a sort of a good example to show why, or like how important conventions have become to me, like that I enjoy them so much. I mean, well, first of all, I met my wife Christy at a convention. We met at the World Fantasy Convention, sort of randomly at the bar, and but then we reconnected online after, and she was our pod turn here on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy, for a while. She was doing our show notes and whatnot. So that's how we got to know each other, and then eventually, we struck up a relationship, and so, and then once we decided to get married, we were talking about like, well, when to do it and whatnot, and so we just decided, to do it at Worldcon, because I was up for the Hugo Award for the first time, so that was, so we were obviously going, and we knew a lot of our friends would be going, and we figured, well, we could do it here in Lompoc, and sort of force everybody to buy a plane ticket, for this one thing. Whereas if we did it at a convention, it would be a lot easier for our friends to make an excuse to come because they could also go to the convention. And so we did it. We did it at Worldcon. And the funny thing is too, so we did it at this place called the Grove in Reno. Because Worldcon was in Reno that year, and then it turns out George R.R. Martin also got married there during the convention.
Later that same day, right?
Yeah, later that same day. Yeah, Dave was saying that if he had known, he would have hidden the bushes, so he could watch.
Okay, I just had some funny stories I wanted to mention. I'm not sure if these are true or not, but they're funny, and that's good enough for me. So I heard like back in the '60s, it was like. Sort of a tradition that all the fans would get naked and jump in the hotel pool all at the same time at every convention. Anyone ever heard about that?
I hope that's not true.
I cannot confirm or deny it.
We got to ask Robert Silverberg. He would know. We'll have to bring him on as a guest geek.
Just ask him that.
Let's call him up right now.
Anyway, I think we got to bring that back.
I'm
not sure about that.
You get right on that, Dave.
I would frown upon that being brought back. For one.
And then, like, I heard this story one time where this like old time author showed up at a convention. He had been invited as the guest of honor, and he was talking to the person running the con committee or whatever. And said, so where's the fan who's going to have sex with me? And the person was like, what? He's like, well, because I'm the guest of honor, there's like a fan who's supposed to have sex with me. And she was like, I think you're on your own there, dude. We don't do that. He's like, but I'm the guest of honor. And I don't know.
Wait, where was this convention taking place in 12th century England? What is going on?
Nobody's ever heard. I don't know. I just heard that one time.
Yeah. I've only heard about that from you. So.
Does anyone else have any other sort of funny stories, or like funny rumors? Oh, there was also I have another one. So this is sort of a notorious thing, but I guess there's this notorious thing where there was this these fans at a convention who were kind of into BDSM sort of stuff, and they hung their harness type thing from the spout, whatever, in the sprinkler in the ceiling.
Yeah. And
it ended up, tearing out of the ceiling and flooding the whole hotel. And
yeah, I did hear about that. And it actually ruined that convention, right?
Yeah, they were not invited back next year.
I did hear that rumor.
I guess I have kind of a funny story. So when I met Patrick Rothfuss, who wrote The Name of the Wind, his novel hadn't come out at that point, I think, but he was at WisCon and I met him, and so I was sitting with a group of people, and so we were all just chatting, and he was carrying around a backpack, and so at some point, we're chatting, and he's chatting with us, and as he's chatting, he pulls up his backpack and he starts digging around in there. So he takes out these two vials, and so one vial has some white powder in it, and the other vial has some sort of black stuff in it, and so we're like, what do you got there? And so he says, well, okay, well, this one, the white one, he said, this is powdered caffeine or something like that. And he's like, okay. And this is what's the other one? And he's like, oh, this is activated charcoal. It's like, I don't know, what do you use that for? Why are you carrying that? He's like, in case someone tries to poison me. And I said, why are you worried about someone trying to poison you? And he's like, oh, I'm not. I've got the activated charcoal. And to this date, I don't know if that was just a joke. Like, was that like a prop comic basically, or was he serious? I don't know. I mean, if I ever got poisoned, I wouldn't be laughing then. I wish I had some activated charcoal.
Exactly.
And actually, as an editor who rejects a lot of writers, it's probably better for me to be carrying around the activated charcoal than him. I mean, you know, I think all those rejected writers would have much more reason to poison me than anybody would have to poison Pat Rothfuss.
I mean, so Chris, you mentioned that, you know, since you moved away from New York, that you were going to, you know, be going to a lot more conventions so you could keep in touch with everyone. Like what kind of conventions have you gone to recently?
Well, I mean, I actually just got back last week from my first ICFA convention, the International Conference on Fantastic and the Arts that you mentioned earlier, I believe was your first convention, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You want to explain maybe? It's like half academic.
Yeah, it's sort of a unique convention among these that we're talking about because, yeah, a good 50% or more of it seems to be devoted. It's an actual academic conference like you might see in other disciplines where students and professors and whatnot are coming from universities all around the world, really, presenting actual papers that they've written, you know, scholarly papers on various topics in on fantastic literature. And, you know, so there's that whole track of programming going on, and there are awards given out at the award ceremony related to that. And then at the same time, the other half of it is more like a more literary leaning regular science fiction and fantasy convention, like a ReaderCon or a World Fantasy, where, or a Capclave, let's say, where you've got readings and panels. And I mentioned also Capclave. I've been to a couple of those. That's in Rockville, Maryland, and that's sort of a convention that bills itself as sort of focusing on fiction in the short form. That's sort of what they're known for. They give out the short fiction award there every year. I've really been recently enjoying going to WisCon, which is in Madison, Wisconsin, every year. And then another convention that's got a definite overlap with the science fiction and fantasy field that I've been going to ever since it started. Is the Historical Novel Society Conference, which, as the name implies, focuses on historical fiction. They had their first convention in 2005, and it's every other year since then. And, you know, the guests of honor have definitely, there's been a lot of overlap. I mean, you've got not only the hardcore historical fiction writers like Bernard Cornwell and Jack White, but you've also got, they've had Harry Turtledove as a guest of honor, and Diana Gabaldon and Sharon K. Penman. I mean, you know, different people where there's a lot of overlapping interest, I think, with people who read science fiction and fantasy as well.
Yeah, and, you know, I mean, I think if you're trying to decide which conventions to go to, like Dave mentioned earlier, you know, in the back of Asimov's, they usually have a listing of conventions that are coming up. Ansible, which is a, you know, perennial Hugo Award nominee for fanzine. I guess now they're technically calling it a semi-prozine, but anyway, it's online for free. If you Google Ansible by David Langford, it has a very good convention listing as well. On the other thing too, like, I mean, if you just want to meet one of your favorite authors or whatever, usually if you go to their website, like, you can find something that will mention their public appearances. Like I have something like that on my website, and a lot of people do. But I'm actually going to a convention this weekend. Since we're speaking of it, there's one called FogCon up in the San Francisco area. It's a smaller convention. It's only the second one they've done. But so, I mean, I don't really know much about it at this point, except that I know a bunch of the people who are running it, and I know that they're con savvy, and I trust that it'll be a good con. And I mean, because I heard very good things about the first one. And then later this year, Dave and I will actually both be at the Confluence Science Fiction Convention in Pittsburgh. And Dave, do you want to talk about that one a little bit? You've been to it a number of times, right?
Oh yeah, I've been to it like the last 10 years or something. Yeah, it's in Pittsburgh. It's one of the smaller conventions I've ever been to. So it would be a pretty good one if you've never been to one before. It's not overwhelming or anything. It's just in this DoubleTree Hilton hotel, and and they have most of the standard stuff. You know, there's a dealer's room and panels and room parties and stuff. And yeah, and I'll be there, and John, and you can't help running into us probably repeatedly because it's because it's such a small convention.
Yeah, actually, one of the great things about conventions too, like mentioning, how you just run into people, like, I mean, at these smaller ones, like something like ReaderCon in particular, like I'm thinking like ReaderCon is in July also, and it's in the Boston area. It's in Burlington technically, but in sort of the Boston area. Like, you go to this, go to the con, and the hotel's just really well set up so that, like, you just always like run into people just like walking from place to place, and like the dealer's room is really a great place to run into people, especially at something like ReaderCon because because it's so book focused.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember one time when I went there and I was in the dealer's room and it was just like, God, I mean, I had only intended to pop in and walk around, and I was just like in there for hours because I just kept running into people as I was walking around and just getting into conversations. So, other things we mentioned Worldcon and World Fantasy. Those are like the two big ones, I would say. Those are my favorites usually. And World Fantasy is probably my all-time favorite convention. But so Worldcon is in usually it's in late August or early September, although it varies a bit. It's always around that time though. And this year it's in Chicago. And then World Fantasy also moves around. It's always somewhere around Halloween. And this year it's in Toronto. So if you're interested in any of those, you can Google those and find out more information about all of them. And they always have guests of honor, and so like that's actually a good way to find out whether or not you want to go to this particular convention. Because like if one of your favorite authors is the guest of honor, then they're going to be on a lot of programming. Like they do several items every day. They'll have special reading events. They'll probably have a live interview.
And Dave, your initial question about this, it really is true that. I mean, when we all met, we were basically living in the, wider New York City area. And, there it's like, we kind of take it for granted that we had all these opportunities for genre events that go on there, like the KGB readings and the New York Review of Science Fiction readings, and the Stifler reception is there every year. And there's all sorts of, events like, book launch parties in the city. But once you move away from a sort of point like that, where there's all that stuff going on, these sorts of conventions are just a great way to keep in the loop and to kind of keep yourself involved with the community, the industry, and just to kind of keep in touch with the friends that you've made in the past at these events. It's definitely been a lifeline for me now that I've moved into more, I don't know, let's say the literary hinterlands of the country.
Well, and you were saying, Chris, that you're the only one of us who ever sort of walked cold into a convention. How did you actually meet those first couple people?
I don't know if I just was lucky or, I don't think I was. I think it's just that really there are just a lot of great, kind, warm people that go to these conventions. Because I remember just on the first day, probably just wandering around with a bewildered look on my face. And at the time, young upstart writer Carrie Vaughn just wandered up to me, who I had never met before in my life. And she just introduced herself and said, is this your first convention? Because it probably looked like it was. And she said, well, why don't you come hang out with me and my friends? And, we're going to be doing this later. We'll go to lunch. And sort of that whole weekend, she and her little posse just kind of took me under their wing and, brought me around to room parties later that night, which I probably wouldn't have even known about otherwise because I was so clueless.
Yeah, I found that that's happened to me a number of times, and I've made some really good friends that way. We just sort of randomly run into people like, Blake Charlton, who we had on the show. We met at a convention like that and just became really good friends. And also James Sutter, who we had on as a guest geek recently. You run into these people who are passionate about those things, but then also passionate about something else. Like James Sutter and I kind of bonded over both of us loving death metal. If you go to a convention, like don't wear a geeky science fiction t-shirt. Wear a t-shirt that says something about one of your other interests. I like to wear my metal t-shirts at a convention because then it's like, well, if somebody also likes metal, they'll see my metal shirt and maybe they'll bring up, oh, hey, I like that band or whatever. Sort of a good way to broach a wider subject, and you can connect with people on other levels as well.
Usually in the room where the registration is, there's a board up where people will list parties that they're hosting later that night. very informal, usually, just sort of a bunch of people gathering in a room, sometimes in the convention suite or in some other offsite location, but usually just up in one of the rooms in the hotel. And they're generally open to anyone who's at the convention to coming in. It's not like you need a special invitation most of the time.
And actually, even if you're not going to just one of the parties, like usually the cons have a con suite where they'll have snacks and stuff and free sodas and whatever. Often book publishers will throw a party, to sort of, they'll pin up a bunch of their book covers on the wall and that kind of thing. And so one to look out for is like the tour party. A lot of conventions have a tour party. Worldcon and World Fantasy always do. And then some of the other ones do, like WisCon usually has one. But they usually throw a really good party.
And sometimes the parties are a little more elaborate or themed. I mean, there was a great party that at the most recent World Fantasy convention that Nora NK Jemison threw. That was a pajama party where, you were encouraged to wear pajamas, but more than that, she had a whole bunch of sort of retro games and stuff there. And so over the course of this party, I at one point was playing Hungry Hungry Hippos with Ellen Datlow. At another point in the party, I was the spinner calling out the colors for a game of Twister in which Karen Lord ended up being the champ that night. I mean, it was just sort of these bizarre moments that, it's like, what is going on here?
Yeah. Well, and the George R. R. Martin fan group, the Brotherhood Without Banners, they often throw really good parties. Actually, when Worldcon was in LA, I guess someone, one of the people in the group worked in Hollywood or something, and somehow they got this giant prop castle portcullis towers thing, that you walked through to get into the party, and that was pretty impressive.
Yeah, actually, at one of those parties, I remember George Martin was actually there, and he was sitting and hanging out with all his fans.
And George R. R. Martin, he's been sending people on quests too at conventions. Really? Yeah, in order to become an official member of the Brotherhood or knight or something. Yeah, he sends them on bizarre quests. I think, like find me a cheesesteak sandwich, and it's at 1 o'clock in the morning. And people have apparently gone to great lengths to fulfill these, satisfy these quests.
Oh my God, that's awesome! I hadn't heard about that.
Yeah.
Occasionally, like, people have done like tea parties in the afternoon, which is actually, I think, a really cool idea because, sometimes, you get sort of worn out on going to panels and stuff. But like, oh, I could, go with, I could use some tea or I could use some snacks or, just chatting, and so like Strange Horizons often throws a tea party.
Well, in some conventions, they'll have coffee klatches.
Oh, yeah.
And or literary beers. And so they, it's kind of that thing where you're sitting around a table with one or two well-known authors, but you have to sign up for it, usually like at the registration desk. And so it's important that you know about that and you go and sign up for it right away because those things fill up really fast.
One other thing that I know they do at Worldcon and likely at other conventions too is if you're an aspiring writer, you can sign up for writing workshops that they do at Worldcon. At the most recent one in Reno, actually, I was one of the sort of workshop leaders there, and they break it down. It sort of follows the Milford model, the Clarion model of critiquing, but you get put into a group of 3 other writers who have submitted their work in advance, and there's 2 moderators, bigger name usually, writers or editors or whatnot, and you can get your pieces critiqued that way. They, it's pretty extensive too. I mean, there were, I don't remember. I mean, something like 30 or 40 different workshop leaders and instructors, going on. There's about 15 sessions that happen throughout the weekend for writers. That's also something people might be interested in looking into.
All right, so I think that's pretty much all we have to say about conventions at the moment. I guess just to wrap things up, Chris, do you want to talk about some of your writing stuff you're working on?
Sure. As probably has become obvious from this discussion, a lot of what I write is historically themed. So far, I've mostly been writing short fiction. I've had about a dozen stories that have appeared in various magazines, most recently, as you mentioned, in Black Static. And I had a piece that appeared most recently, I guess, in Alan Kozowski's Inhuman magazine. Currently, I've been working on longer form fiction. The piece, as you mentioned earlier, that I'm working on now is a novel that returns the Lady Godiva legend to its, hopefully a more plausible historical context, given that the legend as we know it of her riding naked on horseback through the town almost certainly did not happen the way that we've received it. But I do put that back into its less anachronistic 11th century English setting. And the story is really something of a psychological thriller.
See if there are any agents or editors listening who are intrigued by that. How should they get in touch with you?
You can contact me through my website, which is www.christophermsabasco.com.
All right, great. So, John, what have you been up to lately, publishing-wise?
Yeah, and so I just had a new anthology come out called Armored. It's out from Baen, and it's an anthology of stories about power armor and mecha. Dave has a story in there, and actually you can, if you go to johnjosephadams.com/armored, there's a official website for the book set up there. You can read some free stories and read interviews with the authors and just find out more about the book. And Dave, you want to mention like your story in Lightspeed or something?
Yeah, so I guess if people want to check out something I wrote, the March issue of Lightspeed has a short story of mine called Beauty, which is sort of a twisted contemporary take on the legend of Beauty and the Beast. And this is a story I'm quite proud of. It. I've actually read it to crowds a number of times, and people always laugh a lot and seem to really enjoy it. So I'm really happy it's finally out there in the world with a great illustration by Gail and Dara. All right, cool. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Chris, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
And thanks to Morgan Spurlock for being on the show. If you have any questions or comments about anything we talked about today, please post a comment on the post for this episode over at wired.com. And you can find that by going to our website at geeksguideshow.com and clicking on the link for episode 57.
All right, well, that was our show. Thanks, everyone, for listening. See you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.